Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world for this conversation on what to expect from the SDG Summit happening next week in New York. My name is Trine Smit, and I'm an advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development and part of the SDG Lab at U in Geneva, where I'm tuning in from today. And this webinar is organized in partnership with the SDG Lab, IISD, and CEPEI. Now, before we get going, I just have a couple of housekeeping rules. So we do have a chat open. It's great if you want to introduce yourself. We often see quite a lively chat. So just be mindful and respectful in the chat as you share your opinions on the different topics that we'll be covering. We also have a Q&A function because we will have time for questions further down the line. So remember, you can use the Q&A function and you can vote up the questions that you think we should really aim to tackle. We're just going to give 1 minute for people to trickle in. And while we do so, I'm pleased to share that we have almost 1,000 people registered for this webinar today. And they're coming from academia, civil society, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and the private sector. So I think it's safe to say that there's really an interest in this summit from all across different sectors and all across the world. When you signed up for this webinar, we asked you, what should we really prioritize in the next 7.5 years of SDG implementation? And overwhelmingly, some of the things you answered was climate action and SDG localization. But there's also topics around gender equality, addressing the triple planetary crises, SDG 17 and partnerships, as well as education and health. So I think it's clear that there's no lack of the work that we need to do and the work ahead of us in the next 7.5 years. And with that, I think we'll get going. I'll just quickly remind you that this is recorded, as the webinar will be available later on, and you are recorded. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Natalie Bernasconi, who is the co-CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Natalie, she's also the Vice President for Global Strategies at ISD, as well as the Managing Director for Europe, and heading up ISD's Economic Law and Policy Program. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Trine. And on behalf of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, and our partners at the SDG Lab here in Geneva, and the Centro de Pensamiento Estratégico Internacional, CEPEI, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to today's conversation on what to expect for the SDG Summit, which will take place in New York next week, almost exactly 8 years after the General Assembly unanimously adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2015, the historic and comprehensive 15-year global plan of action to end poverty, reduce inequalities, and protect the environment set the stage for a new era to come and set out an ambitious agenda for people and the planet. The SDG Summit next week marks the halfway point of this 2030 agenda. It will be a critical moment for dialogue on how to stay on track and meet the aspirations of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It will be a moment for us to find new energy to pour into the commitments hailed as historic 8 years ago. Finding new energy won't necessarily be easy at a time of polycrises where we seem to be moving apart rather than coming together. But we need to find it. We need to come together to safeguard this collective vision for the world we inhabit, this beautiful planet that we share amongst ourselves and also with future generations. We still have some 7 years to go, and we need to double down on our efforts on the SDGs, while at the same time looking beyond. Let's carry the power of the SDGs forward with the future in mind, because the systems we build and strengthen to advance the SDGs today will have impacts tomorrow and beyond 2030. With this enthusiasm and hopefulness for what is yet to come, I am thrilled to introduce to you now two eminent representatives from the permanent missions of Ireland and Qatar, John Gilroy and Sheikh Abdul Rahman Al Thani. Both of these gentlemen have been working relentlessly in the lead up to the SDG Summit next week to negotiate the draft political declaration that is to come out of the summit. Alongside them, we are very happy to also have Nudara Yusuf. Nudara is Executive Coordinator of the Global Governance Innovation Network at the Stimson Center and also Global Youth Coordinator at the Coalition for the UN We Need. Our moderator will introduce our speakers in more detail in a moment, but before handing the floor over to her, I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to sit down with us today for this webinar. This webinar is part of a webinar series in collaboration with the UN SDG Lab and CEPEI, providing information and analysis on the high-level political forum for sustainable development. We are joined by people from across the world, and I invite you, as Trina also has, to take active part in the discussion using the Q&A and chat function. We want to hear from you to help us make this SDG Summit count. And finally, before moving to our moderator, Trina Schmidt, I want to encourage you all to sign up to IISD's Earth Negotiations Bulletin to keep abreast of developments at the SDG Summit and the Climate Ambition Summit. Many of you are already acquainted with the reporting that we do, that we bring to all of you across the globe to ensure transparency, accountability, and inclusive processes. So I encourage you to sign up if you haven't. And now, Trina, back to you and to the speakers. I look forward to listening to you right now.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for those great opening remarks. And thank you also for introducing our distinguished speakers today. So I'll say a little bit more, and I invite our speakers to come on camera as I introduce you. So first up, we have Nudara Yusuf, who, as Natalie mentioned, is the executive coordinator of the Global Governance Innovation Network at Stimson Center. But you're also the Global Youth Coordinator at the Coalition for the UN We Need. And there you were coordinating the Global Futures Forum, which happened earlier this year in March in a hybrid format in New York, and which saw the interim's People's Pact for the Future. I'm sure we'll hear more about that a little later on. You've also worked at the United Nations Development Program, where you were in the SDG Integration Unit, and much other super interesting and relevant experience that we're excited to hear from you later on. With us, we also have Sheikh Abdul Rahman Al Thani. If you could please come on camera. And you are with the permanent mission of the state of Qatar to the United Nations in New York. And here you've been you focused primarily on economic and financial committees, so what we also know as the second committee of the United Nations. And you've worked really closely with our other speaker, John Gilroy, on facilitating this process, as Natalie mentioned, towards the declaration to be adopted next week in New York. And that brings me to John Gilroy, who leads on climate and sustainable development at the permanent mission of Ireland to the United Nations, also based in New York. And you have an extensive knowledge of the SDGs, as you were actually part of the team back in the days negotiating from the Irish side on the 2030 agenda when they were co-facilitating the negotiations. You've also assisted in voluntary national reviews for Ireland. And you've, as I said, worked very closely with Abdul Rahman on this political declaration. I could say much more about our distinguished speakers because they all have very impressive resumes, but in the sake of time, I think we will shoot off. So as I mentioned, there is a Q&A function. Don't be shy, please use it. We want to hear from you. And I realize that we're all sitting behind our screens in some shape or form, but really I'd love you to imagine that you're sitting at your local coffee shop or tea house, and we have our distinguished speakers sitting in comfortable chairs, and we're all gathered around to really just hear from them in more of an informal conversation what they are expecting for next week and why they're so excited about this summit. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions for our speakers, and then afterwards we'll have time to hear your questions from around the world. So Nujara, if I kick off with you, for some of those who've not been as involved as you have with the preparations of the SDG Summit and also looking already towards the summit of the future, why does the summit matter? What are like 3 things that you're looking forward to for next week?
Thank you so much, Shin, and I have my coffee on the side here ready to go. And thanks to all of you for joining today, for those who are helping to pull this webinar together, and for the opportunity. So to come back to your question, why does this summit matter? I was actually explaining this to a group of high school students recently, and I think that analogy was helpful, so I'll use it here. Imagine you're at a football game or soccer if you're from America, and it's halftime, right? For the first half of the game, we've been trying to score goals. We've been attempting a couple different strategies. We're not quite scoring the goals that we want to be scoring. There's a couple different plays here. The teams are not necessarily equal. There's different resources, capacity for the different teams that are at play. So, they call halftime. Do we continue playing and just see what happens, not really sort of take a moment to re-strategize? Or do we go back and say, hey, what went well? What went wrong? What are we going to do now? And I think that's the importance of the SDG Summit. It's the moment where we're coming together and saying, okay, 15% of them are on track. We have achieved 15% of the goals. So something has gone right. But 48% are sort of completely off track, and somewhere in between or regressed, and somewhere in between there's static. So what do we need to do differently? And I think that's really the moment that we're seeing with the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, the halfway point. And it's if we don't do that reevaluation, we're going to be continuing to play the same game we've played and that we haven't really scored goals with. So 7.5 years to kind of turn the second half of the game round. But as for the 3 things to sort of emerge out of this summit, and I should say, the political declaration does a really good job of the substance, and just on a sincere level, tipping my hat to Qatar and Ireland for facilitating this in what was a not so easy negotiating process. And I'm sure that I don't have to tell John and Abdul Rahman that. But also, so I think the political declaration deals with a lot of the substance. I think that the global sustainable development report that has come out deals with a lot of the science. And I think that there's integrated streams as well in existing agendas. So whether it be Paris, Addis Ababa, the major groups have been focused on the VNRs, and they've been sort of convening civil society in different ways. We have the regional forums discussing sort of different integrated tracks as well. But one of the key gaps here is, how are we managing all of the agendas? How are we managing all of the streams of work happening around the Sustainable Development Goals? I think what we hope to see as a result of this summit is some sort of distilling and a knowledge management that can help us push forward for the next 7.5 years. So, 17 goals. We have 6 high-level meetings happening across the UNGA this year. We have 12 priorities from UN 75. The Our Common Agenda is turbocharging. The 11 sort of policy briefs that are coming out of the Summits of the Future. So all of this needs to be distilled in some way. I don't think it's all going to happen at the summit, but I think it's an effort that needs to begin. And I like to think of it, at least for my sanity, in 3 buckets of agendas or issues, however you want to look at it. The first is the bucket of items that we can just do now, because we already have the principles agreed on. It's a case of implementation. The Secretary General can just push forward on it, or UN country teams can just push forward on it. It's all there, we just need to implement it. So that's sort of bucket number 1. Bucket number 2 is sort of the do soon category of the principles are there, the norms are there. We've sort of identified that this really does need to go place. There's generally consensus, but we just need that treaty or that tool or that institutional reform, that entry point that's going to help us push that agenda through. I think that's sort of a critical bucket that needs to be explored at the SDG Summit. And finally, you have the third bucket of items, which I feel unfortunately have taken over the agenda in many cases and really should just be that sort of third priority area of here are the things that are still contentious, but we realize we need to talk about. So there's several things that fall under that category, but I think that those are the items that we need to start discussing now and continue to explore through to the summits of the future and potentially a World Social Summit in 2025. But I'll stop there because I know we want this to be a conversation. And I'm really curious to hear what John and Abdul Rahman have to say too.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for that. I'm sorry, I think there's some delay in my end with my connection today, typical. But I really like how you categorize it into these three buckets. I find that to be super useful, the do now, do soon, and the contentious issues that we do need to talk about and treat at some point in time. And I want to pass it over to Abdul Rahman from your perspective, building on Mudara's speech here. What are you looking forward to at the summit, and how do you refer to these three buckets? What are your three things? Over to you.
Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation. I would start from the half point. Now we are at the half point. We see the games still going. We still have 7.5 years. Every day counts. We also see that there are some red cards and some yellow cards. We are not just seeing that it's just over yet. So I would like to remind that developing countries seeing that this is an urgent call where we are in the midpoint. It is not just what is after 2030. They see that 7 years is more than enough for pushing forward the agenda with the goodwill and high engagement. I think solidarity also is very important, and partnership and collaboration is the main maybe theme to boost the agenda. But we also need not to forget that next week, the high engagement by head of state and governments will be very crucial to push the agenda forward. So result of commitment and accelerated progress, enhanced financial commitments, and fostering partnership and cooperation. That are the three main important points that I would like to see in the next week. But as I said, some member states seeing this as an urgent call at the midpoint to boost the agenda. But some other member states are thinking, oh, we are lagging behind. We don't think that we will reach the full agenda, which is important because if some member states seeing that, they need to talk about it and how to support these goals to be able to reach as much as possible, maybe if not committing it fully, but as much as possible to 2030. Maybe these are the points that I would like to share, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you hit the spot there around there's certainly different paces around the world, both in an uptake and action on the agenda. And I really appreciate your concerns around financing and collaboration, and that we do have 7 years to really prove what we can do within that amount of time. John, I want to come over to you and sort of ask you that same question, but add a little bit more to it. So why are you excited? What's your top 3 things? But also, you know, we've heard the Secretary General say that with the several high-level events happening next week, that September must be this moment of unity to provide a renewed impetus and accelerated action for reaching the SDGs. How will we do that? How will the SDG Summit raise ambition? So that's a lot for you, and over to you.
Thanks, Trina, and big thanks to the organizers. I'm delighted to be here today. I remember as a young diplomat, I appeared in the Art Negotiations Bulletin for the first time in the background of a photo, and I remember how excited I was. That must have been 2004, 2005. So it's great to be back working with you again. Coming on here after two excellent interventions, it wasn't a whole lot more to say. Maybe to add for the US listeners or participants, my sporting metaphor, imagine we're the New York Jets and we've just lost our star quarterback after the first quarter. How do we come back and turn things around? If the Jets can beat the Bills without their quarterback, we can achieve the 2030 agenda, no problem. So on the question, Trina, I think the summit is really, really critical, and I think that, and what I've heard and the commitments I've seen and the discussions around the UN at the moment, thankfully there's no sense of kind of razzmatazz or congratulation or the SDGs are great. There's a real realism here of how badly we are off track, and there's kind of a somber tone, and that's appropriate because the world we set out to create back in 2015, we're further away from that. It's time to take a hard look at how badly we are off track. But in terms of hope, there is still time. We're at the halfway point. And, look at how much the world has changed since 2015, sadly for the worse. But if all that has happened in the last 7.5 years can happen, why can't we mirror that transformation and upheaval, but in a positive way? That's one optimistic lesson I take from the challenges that we faced since 2015. Change is possible. Sadly, we've had the wrong kind of change, but let's make it the right kind of change for the next 7.5 years. Top three things that jump out at me, and this is going to happen. I think that the real core message of the summit and of the political declaration is a clear and unambiguous recommitment to the 2030 agenda by member states, by all stakeholders. This is still our blueprint. To paraphrase John Kerry, it's our last best hope, and it remains a valid plan toward that world transformed. The second thing that I think we tried to capture in the declaration, and I think that there's definitely growing awareness of this, maybe a little bit later than we would have liked, but a recognition of the complexity of the SDGs. A lot of member states, harking back to 2015, were critical that there's too many, it's too complicated, but it's a really complicated solution to a really, really, really complicated problem. And I think that we need to understand and harness the synergies and the trade-offs in terms of policy and program implementation of the SDGs and meaningfully integrate them into our national development processes. And I'm hoping in the commitments that member states are going to make on Monday and Tuesday, that's going to be a strong element coming out of it. And then the third thing is on financing, and maybe I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on this morning, but the means of implementation is absolutely fundamental to the 2030 agenda. And there's some pretty important and significant actions and commitments in the declaration in relation to financing the SDGs. It isn't the final word on a lot of these issues, but hopefully it really does add momentum. And if you look at the G20 discussions even recently in the declaration that came out of that, they're kind of mirroring some of the language that is in the draft SDG political declaration. And I think we're already, just even by our work over the last 8 months, moving the needle a bit on some of these conversations, which I think is really, really positive. And then just on your additional question at the end, it's going to be a crazy week. This is my 13th high-level week I've been involved in. I've never seen anything like it. We've the summit, we've the general debate opening, of course. We have the FFD meeting, we have the Summit of Future Ministerial, the 3 health summits, and the Climate Ambition Summit. And it certainly, as somebody who's trying to work out programs and movements of politicians over the coming days, it's definitely way too much. But at the same time, just having all these conversations at the same time should foster understanding, and back to this idea I was talking about of synergies and looking at things in a holistic way. And hopefully we'll see that, and we can carry through this holistic approach into the discussions that lay ahead of us, that Nadara mentioned as well, in terms of some of the future, the World Social Summit and the Fourth International Financing for Development Conference. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, lots of great points there. And I see also we have questions coming in, and I promise you we will get to your questions as well. I just have a few more for our speakers before we do so. So I think I like what you just said about look at how much have changed within 7.5 years, and what if we could mirror that into a positive change for the coming 7.5 years. So with that, I think it's a good reminder of just how much time that actually is. And I think turning over to you, Nadara, if we think about the first 7.5 years, one thing I like to think about is the systems that we've been building and that we've been putting in place. And I'm thinking here, for example, of the global indicator framework, of new partnerships that the SDGs have really prompted us to form. So I think the agenda has helped us identify new ways of working. So in your perspective, what's one lessons learned from the first 7.5 years that we should sort of take with us forward and really strengthen and build on?
Thanks, Trin. I'm gonna, if you'll bear with me, talk about two very quick lessons. I think the first is the importance of including the technical expertise of youth and women. But sort of I want to specifically talk about the technical expertise of young people in terms of the intergenerational nature of this process. Since sort of 2017, when the UN Youth Envoy's Office was established, and sort of now 2023, the UN Youth Office being established, a lot of progress has been made, and a lot of this has been to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. Whether you look at the UNESCO SDG 4 Youth Network, whether you look at sort of the different young feminist manifestos that have come up, whether you look at sort of the poverty alleviation movements that are happening around youth, the youth peace and security movement, and generally sort of the major group on youth, on children and youth have been coordinating across the board as well, alongside other youth networks. I think one thing that I would say in terms of what we can take from that moving forward into the next 7.5 years is not to pigeonhole youth into youth as sort of like, this is the youth perspective on something, but rather looking behind that and seeing the technical expertise that young people bring to the table as sort of relevant to new and future generations, and noticing that in 2030, it is the people in their late 20s and early 20s that are going to be in those leadership positions to some extent. And so part of involving young people in the framework, and sort of we see this in the Youth 2030 Progress Reports in the ECOSOC Youth Forum, is really adding a level of sustainability to the agenda itself. So I think that that's sort of a key element. But also in terms of sort of the second very quick thing, what's another lesson learned? See, we hear the term accelerate or turbocharge, and it's great to sort of sparkle up pieces of speeches or information or documents with these terms, but it's important to look behind what that actually means. Like, what do we actually mean by accelerate, or what do we actually mean by turbocharge? And I think that there's three elements to that. I think first, it's about identifying entry points for change at a global governance level. So take something like digital access. We know that that is an accelerator. We know that giving people digital access accelerates across the Sustainable Development Goals. Whether it be, I think there's close to 17 targets across the 17 development goals that have technology explicitly mentioned in the SDGs. But what's the institutional entry point? And this is where I think that different agendas come into play. So if you're going to use the Global Digital Compact as an entry point to help further the Sustainable Development Goals target, what does that look like in practice? And how are we going to leverage this Global Digital Compact as sort of an integrated Sustainable Development Goal on technology? So these are the questions I think that we really need to be asking. I think this involves disaggregated data as well to enable proper tracking and monitoring of the accelerators themselves. So are the accelerators working is an important question that we need to be asking. And finally, closing the feedback loop on all of this. So often what we see at the UN is an agreement or okay, this is what we need to do, or here is the data. But we don't see that being fed back into the process and fed back into evaluating and monitoring the actions themselves. So part of this, and I hope this is a lot of what we'll see at the SDG Summit, is summits are about convening stakeholders. Different people who are parts of different parts of the SDG implementation process are going to be at the SDG Summit. And I think we really need to see some of these feedback loops closing so that we can generate these sort of virtuous cycles of change.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I think I also saw in the chat that there's some appreciation for you bringing up these topics around youth, gender, and digital transformation. Abdulrahman, I was curious from your perspective, if you would share sort of one lessons learned or one success, if you will, that you think we should really keep in mind as we move forward into the next phase of implementation. And then after that, John, will pass it over to you for roughly the same question.
Thank you very much. So I think the most important lesson learned, or the most important point that I would say, is that if we look back in 2015, we did not have the agenda. We did not have a framework that can gather countries together. So I think what we have as of now is a very good framework that brought member states together to focus on these SDGs. I am glad that some of these points that Nodara have said is included in the political declaration, such as disaggregated death. So I'm happy also to hear that from Nodara. But we also need to put to focus that one important lesson learned, that not all of the SDGs and not all the goals and targets are as same as every country, because every country deals with it in a different way. So and overall is that the agenda brought countries together for partnership and reaffirming their commitments to support each other. But also member states, as a lesson learned, they need to be able to support themselves by generating commitments and financial support by others to implement these SDGs in their countries. My final point, I would say, is that my country is one of the countries that supports data tracking. So we work a lot with some of the UN agencies and especially UNDP. So we support data to follow the exact numbers of these SDGs, to be able to share the exact data sources where these SDGs are lacking, or where we are in a better situation. So maybe these are the lessons learned that I would want to share. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think your point around localization is one we see really coming up again and again, that in the second half of implementation, it really is about national ownership and local implementation. John, I wondered if you wanted to add anything from your side in terms of either lessons learned or success, having really followed this since the early days when you were part of negotiating it from the Irish side. What would be your takeaway that we should bring forward?
Yeah, sure. Well, a couple of successes stand out. Firstly, I think it's just the awareness of this agenda globally is really, really impressive. So much of what we do here at the UN, it feels like you're just talking into a hole in a tree, and it disappears. But this is a project, since I've been working on it, 2014, 2015, and beyond, that really resonates and has spread into people's lives, into school curriculums. Just looking at the amount of people on this call from all over the globe, including Ireland. Hi to Frank and Megan and a few others whose names I recognize. It's really, really impressive for the work of the UN. to resonate in such a positive way with so many people. That brings me to my next point in relation to success. The multilateral system has had a very, very difficult time and continues to, and this touches on what Abdul Rahman was saying as well. You look at the impact of COVID, the fallout from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the food, economic, climate crises, the lack of representation on the Security Council, the governance systems of the international financial architecture. There's a real skepticism and weariness about multilateralism, and a feeling that it doesn't work for everybody equally. And we've seen this over the last 8 months, there is still that sense of global solidarity and buy-in by all countries on the SDGs. There's still a universal agenda, and they're meaningful for everybody. And I think that this collective solidarity around the SDGs gives hope for the wider multilateral system. And I think that is a key success in what has been a very, very trying time across the globe. Lessons learned, less positive. And again, this comes back to the issue of data. And this is a weakness, I think, in the if we're allowed to say that there's weaknesses in the 2030 agenda, I think this is certainly one, is the lack of robust monitoring and accountability. Even the words monitoring and accountability, we didn't get away with including them in the agenda. We had to talk about follow-up and review. I think that has hurt the agenda over the last 7.5 years in terms of the voluntary national reviews at the HLPF and the kind of drilling down into the data that the HLPF can do. It isn't as robust as it could be. There's no real benchmark set. If I'm country X and I do my first VNR in 2018, and then I come back and do another one in 2024, no one really goes back and looks at what I said then and measures how far I've come or haven't come since then. You can kind of get up and say what you want without any real accountability. That said, the VNRs are hugely valuable. Ireland just did its second one this year. We had a really meaningful consultation process. We did take it very seriously in terms of data and benchmarking progress, but that needs to be standardized because if we don't know where we are, we've no way of figuring out how to get to where we want to go. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I think, my personal experience as well, having worked on the SDGs since they were adopted, is I completely echo the awareness, but also the new types of partnerships that we've seen come out of this agenda. And I think on the lessons learned, I think maybe that's something that falls into your bucket, Nutara, around the contentious issues as well. So before we turn our eye to the questions in the Q&A, I wondered in this friendly coffee tea house atmosphere, if we might open that bucket also just a little bit and discuss what are some of those more contentious issues that we should be addressing, but we shouldn't let sort of steal the focus at this point in time either. Nutara, do you want to comment? And it's open floor for John and Abdul Rahman as well.
Sure, I can jump in, but I also wanted to react to something that John and I think Abdul Rahman mentioned as well about monitoring and capacity. And I think that this is one of those items that needs to be thought about some more, if not contentious, at least just needs to be discussed. Because I think one of the issues is what are we measuring? So take something like peace and security. Yes, we have targets. Yes, we have indicators. But how do you measure whether peace is working? And equally, how do you measure something that doesn't occur? So part of progress is sort of going in a right direction positively, but also making sure that we don't do the things that are negatively going to affect the SDGs. So how do you measure something that doesn't exist, right? Or isn't happening? And I think that there are efforts around there. The YPS movement is one of those that is trying to come up with these efforts. The New Agenda for Peace, I think, is a helpful tool here as well to sort of start to standardize some of what we mean by progress. And I think that the SDGs do this. I think that there are indicators, but just on a meta level. And I think this is where you know, forums like the Summit of the Future become helpful, because it's about thinking about what is sort of leveling of the playing field. What does that look like? What are sort of the bigger questions that when we're looking from target to target or indicator to indicator, we're not necessarily addressing? And sort of what's the overarching gameplay, so to speak? So I think that's part of it. As for other items, I think we also need to think about what shouldn't be in that third bucket. So things like women and gender equity have, for some reason, sort of in recent negotiations become more contentious than we've expected them to be. And I think that something like that needs to be taken a conscious effort to not be in that contentious bucket, because it really is, you know, looking back at the things we've already agreed on in the UN, a fundamental principle that is part of the functioning of the UN system. So part of the effort of addressing this slightly more this newer bucket with maybe more uncertainties, so whether we're looking at sort of AI and tech and how do we deal with that, or whether we're looking at sort of the climate security nexus and what does that look like, and what are sort of different agenda items in that space moving forward, we need to look back on what the UN has already agreed on, so that we're not trying to re-agree on the things that we've already agreed on, but rather go from point A to point B and not renegotiate point A again and again and again. And I think that the SDG Summit is a real opportunity to do that and to sort of push forward to address some of these more contentious items, but think about what shouldn't go in that bucket, because we've already discussed it. And it's sort of a circular way of answering your question, Trine, but I hope that gives some food for thought.
No, I think that was a very clear answer, and thank you for that. I know that I promised John and Abdul Rahman to also come in, but I wanted to start opening and integrating a bit the questions from the chat. So if you don't mind, I'll start sort of weaving some of those in, and then feel free to also reflect on what Nudara just said. So one thing that's come up, and we see several questions in the chat, and I'm trying to summarize them a bit here so we catch as many as possible. But Abdul Rahman, you mentioned the topic of localization, and one of the questions that we have from one of our participants is around how will the SDG Summit be helpful in addressing the fact that some national governments seems to be a bit hesitant also around local authorities' involvement. So here we can think about cities or municipalities that have increasingly become very active, and the voluntary local reviews. Do you think this is something that we'll see being addressed during the SDG Summit? So that's one question. And then I'll just quickly put another question out there for afterwards, which is around several of the questions revolves around what do we really need to scale up in the next period of time? I think you've already mentioned a bit, but I think participants are really looking at what can we do in the next 7.5 years. So over to you first, Abdul Rahman, and then John, if you have any reflections as well.
Thank you very much. So first of all, we don't need to forget that the summit is a very high-level summit. It's in a head of state and government. So head of state and governments will need to say what they are doing in their countries and what they have done for the last 7.5 years, because their citizens will be hearing them and will account them, be accountable for what they are saying. So it is an important moment for head of state and government to reaffirm that all of these SDGs will be localized within their countries. Within the understanding, there are some of these laws, some of these blocks that might not be able to do all of the SDGs, but all the targets, but as much as possible to localize these targets and SDGs within their countries. So they will be accountable. They will be here through the summit. So localization would be one of the most important points at the summit. But some of these countries are facing a lot of issues with finance to localize SDGs. So it depends on who are you saying for which country and how they are adopting the SDGs, and if they have already put these SDGs within their framework of their laws, of their municipalities. So it's not just it's case by case. It's not about an overall. So I think that's maybe what I wanted to say on this point.
Thank you. I think it's a very good point on the case by case, and we can also see that now, right, in the way that countries include local authorities in some of their delegations or in their work around their VNRs. And John, I wondered if you might take the question from our participants around what is really needed to ramp up action in the second half. And here specifically, maybe if you could elaborate a bit on this point around accountability. So we've heard some people mention, you know, as in the climate negotiations, we see you have to come back and increase your ambition. Is this a model that we could learn from? So do you have any thoughts on this? Thank
you. Thanks. Well, that's a big question, and I'll get around to it as quickly as I can. Just maybe on the contentious bucket, from the perspective of the negotiations on the declaration for the last 8 months, there was a lot of contentious issues. Nidara is right around gender. You know, we do feel like we're going backwards. There's no reference in the text to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. We weren't able to include a reference to sexual and gender-based violence. We do have some quite good language on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls and the importance of ending all violence against women and girls, but it's still a contentious discussion when it shouldn't be. Other issues that were difficult, you know, around the right to development, around the, you know, sovereignty and the primacy of states rather than stakeholders in terms of implementing the agenda. Obviously, the whole financing piece as well was very, very difficult. And even compared to the 2015 negotiations, where we didn't really have to get into the financing because that was being dealt with in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda track, it was really, really tough. And I'm surprised that we did make the progress that we did. Very, very pleasantly surprised. But in terms of that contentious bucket, we don't need to measure the value of a declaration or a summit outcome on the basis of, you know, doing a keyword search and saying, oh, this word is there, this word isn't there. It comes back to this really strong reaffirmation of the entire 2030 agenda and all its principles and commitments, and that's there and remains valid. On ramping up implementation over the next 7.5 years, we just really need to keep pushing and trying to build momentum. And I think we're really lucky that we have these big processes that are going to be ongoing at the UN, at the Summit of the Future, the work on and the various associated tracks with that Nidara has mentioned around the Global Digital Compact, around the Declaration on Future Generations, and many other areas. And these aren't about talking about what happens after 2030. It's a chance for us to really meaningfully integrate the SDGs into new, really, really important areas that can be accelerators in and of themselves. On accountability, it comes back to numbers and data and monitoring what member states and others say they're going to do, and then when they don't do it, say to them, well, you said this and you haven't. Why not? What are you going to do to get back on track? And that hasn't really happened. And it's okay to be ambitious, and it's okay to fail. And this is something else that hasn't really happened in the HLPF either. You know, I think back to some very early discussions with Thomas Gass and others around what the HLPF should be, that I don't think it really is. It should be, you know, a country like Ireland saying, okay, we're doing great on all these things, but we don't want to talk about our successes. We want to talk about our failures. We want to talk about inequality in our society. We want to talk about our mental health crisis. We want to talk about homelessness in Ireland, and say, well, look, we're not doing well on this, and talk to other member states that have maybe had some of the same challenges and come up with their own solutions, and then try and figure out how we can apply that solution in an Irish context. And so it's okay to say you're not doing well. That's how you learn, and then how you can course correct. If you just pretend that everything's going great and focus on what is working, you're not gonna get very far. And then just maybe one last point on localization. It's certainly true that some member states haven't really integrated the SDGs at a federal level. But Ireland is a member of the Local 2030 Islands Network, and I've been very involved in that network for a number of years, and it's been amazing to work with groups from Hawaii, from Guam, to see the way that the SDGs have really been meaningfully integrated into everyday lives in that island context. And so there's so much that we can learn from localization success stories, and I think that the localization piece, I think we do give it a bit more prominence in this declaration, and I think that is something we need to push forward in the remaining 7.5 years. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. And I like how you bring up that we have different pain points and really the universality of the agenda around looking at home, what are some of our challenges, and having that frank and more honest exchange around the challenges rather than going for our ranking spot amongst other countries. We have several questions coming in. I'm mindful of time. We have 9 minutes left. I want to put just one specific one for Nutara, and then I'll just mention a couple of others. So there's one here that's coming to us from Nepal. They run trainings on the SDGs, and they're asking, how can we make the SDGs cool? We see that climate action is getting all of the attention. Several of the other SDGs doesn't have that same coolness factor. So from a group in Nepal running training for young people, what would be your advice? And before you answer, I just want to say, shoot one over to Abdul Rahman for afterwards. There's a question here around, do we know if there'll be any national commitments happening at the summit? I guess this is a question for both Abdul Rahman and John. And then last but not least, once we've covered that, I think there's some questions around beyond 2030, which we can gently touch upon in relation to the Summit of the Future. But first, Nutara, and then if there's any reflections around national commitments that might be made at the summit.
Thanks so much, Trin, and thank you to whoever brought in that question. And actually, as people who probably see the SDGs in their sleep, I would be curious to see what John and Abdul Rahman think is cool about the SDGs as well. But I think while that's a really fun question, this is a serious issue that we do face in the youth space, is that there's a concentration towards issues that are easier to access and understand. Far more young people engaged in climate than in global financial architecture, because when you get down to the nitty-gritties of debt for finance swaps and reintegrating multilateral development banks to support climate financing, people sort of switch off, right? And it's not necessarily the most accessible agenda to a 13-year-old. So I really think a lot of it is messaging across the overarching items. So what are the common goals? I think actually the political declaration does a good job of it looks at 3 different categories. What are our shared commitments? What's our changing world? What is our call to action? I think that's a good way of framing it. We also have the People, Planet, Prosperity partnership, that framing too. You have the economic, social, environmental framing of the SDGs as well. So I think that those are helpful ways of doing it. But I was talking to my nephews who are 12 and 13 about the Sustainable Development Goals, because what else do you do over dinner, right? And I was saying, what do you think of these goals? What do you think about poverty? What do you think about this? And they honestly said to me, it's really tricky for us to understand what you're saying when you use 100 acronyms, when you use so much jargon. And when I say, how do I learn more? You send me a 30-page report. I really don't have the time to do this as a 12-year-old. I was like, fair enough. A lot of it is just distilling things down to easy to understand and accessible language. I think you have the technical part of global finance, but you can also explain it in easy ways that matter to young people, to say, look, this is about what jobs you can get in the future. This is about your employment capacity in the future. This is about which country you're likely to work in the future, right? And I think that there are ways that you can make agendas more accessible, but also these agendas are so vast that not everyone needs to engage on debt for finance. I think that there are different parts of the agenda that different young people can be engaging with. And if folks are more curious about that, we have sort of a Youth Future series where we bring young people into the fold to work on how we can distill down some of this technical language. Happy to discuss further as well.
Thank you so much. And we're running short up on time here. We have 5 minutes left. I see questions also, again, like national commitments and finance. I wonder if Abdul Rahman and John, do you want to quickly say what can we expect in terms of national commitments, specifically around finance? And then I'll leave time for another question.
Thank you very much. Yesterday we had a briefing by the DSG at the UN, and we have heard a lot of voices that wanted to participate at the opening of the SDG Summit, where they have shared that they are looking for announcing commitments and supporting the implementation of the SDGs. So I'm sure that there will be commitments in the upcoming week, and it will be announced at that moment. So I think that's for the point of national commitments, but also I think we don't need to forget that it's not just climate change. It's different elements of the SDGs. For example, education, youth. We have, for example, we have hosted last year. This year we have hosted LDC 5 for the least developed countries. Next year we have SIDS, we have LLDCs. All of these programs supports the implementation of the SDGs. So I don't think that it's just about climate change, but it is how people are interested in a specific point or other points. There are technology, there are other points that might be interested for others. So I think as an overall the whole agenda is interested and cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know we have a few minutes left. We see a question also around looking ahead beyond 2030. So maybe, John, there's a way you can sort of merge any response on national commitments financing. And then this question really around, and Nutara, maybe you can also have time to come in. As we look at the second half of implementation, are we starting to think about long-term approaches to sustainable development? We hear, that we're challenged with a short-term mindset, and how can we overcome this and make sure that our efforts are for this coming period, but also beyond 2030. So, John, and then any thoughts from Nutara, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Sure. Well, not a whole lot more to add on the national commitments piece. We're hopeful that we are going to hear a lot of clear commitments by member states, what they're going to do in terms of their international policies, but also domestically. I think it's really important that comes through. We'll have to wait and see, but I know that the Secretary General is going to be trying to collate the kind of commitments that are being made and make sure that there is follow-up. And I think that again, this follow-up and accountability for what people are saying they're going to do is key. It's not just about the headline announcements, it's actually delivering on them. I can't let a question on how do you make the SDGs cool without responding. They are cool. They're cool already. You don't need to do anything. They're a wonderfully fascinating but accessible system that, I spent a large part of my lockdown with my 3 kids during COVID with a deck of cards with the SDGs on them, and we just kind of picked random 2 cards every day and then have a chat about why these 2 different issues relate to each other. And the kids, I think, enjoyed it. Maybe they got a bit bored after a month or 2, but it's an agenda that I find really engaging, and it's one of the strengths that we achieved in 2015. But Nutara mentioned the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic, environmental, and social. And I think that if you take it as the default that there's more interest in climate action, you know, why is climate action important? It's important for us as people. It's important for our societies, for our communities, our families. And so if you take as the entry point climate, you can really build that out to understand, you know, what needs to happen economically to protect the climate and the impact that will have on us as individuals, you know, on our rights and our sustainable development. You know, so I think we embrace the interest and passion around climate action, but make sure that that isn't siloed and that it you know, we take that engagement and expand it out into the other dimensions of sustainable development. Look, we're at 10 o'clock. I better pass it back to you, Trina. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, and I'm very mindful of our time. If everyone could spare just 1 minute, I want to just have one last reflection, which is, Nutara, we're looking also to the Summit of the Future. Would you like to share anything on how you see the link between this summit, Summit of the Future, in like a 30-second, 45-second sprint? And then,
Absolutely. And I also just really want to plus one on what John and Abdul Rahman have said as well. I think a really big outcome of the SDG Summit, or at least how I would think about success, is definitely whether there's more awareness and whether there's more clarity on the road going forward. And over the next 12 months, so SDG Summit, Summits of the Future, I think is really about getting on the right side of the multiplier effect. It's about every generation, everything that we do right multiplies. Every generation, everything that we do wrong also multiplies. And I think the next 12 months are about setting us up to get on the right side of that multiplier effect. But in terms of the links between the two, the SDG Summit is really the what, the Summit of the Future is the how in international institutions. It's about leveling the playing field, giving us the institutions and the toolkit that can help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think coming off the back of the SDG, we need to see SDG Summit, we need to see follow through into the Summit of the Future. And we really need to see the outcomes of the SDG Summit feed into and serve as sort of a fundamental building block for the conversations that are going to be set up at the Summit of the Future.
Thank you so much. I'm impressed at how you managed to do that in such short time. And I really like the what and the how. I think that helps simplify a bit for all of us who are a bit sometimes confused about these many processes. So I know that we don't have any more time. I just want to say a huge thank you to the three of us, but also to all of our participants in their coffee tea houses around the world who've been tuning in and stayed with us all the way through. I want to say that we do have a debrief webinar as well, which is happening on the 28th of September. My colleague just put the information in the chat. So at the same time, 28th of September, where we, with our partners, will be debriefing on then what actually happened. So stay tuned for that one as well. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but I think it's just a testimony to how engaged you are and what you want to see at the summit. So thank you so much for all of your time. We look forward to catching up again with you on the other side. And a good win to you all. Thank you to John and Abdul Rahman for your work on the political declaration. And thank you to Nutara and all your work that you do, especially involving young people. So that's all from our side. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your week. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.